Hello again, everyone. We'll continue our coverage now of the Plata variation, where white goes bishop e3 to f2, but we'll look at the more modern interpretation and white's second most common line. The line we just checked in the previous video saw white play knight d3 and c5, but hopefully I convinced you that as long as we don't allow white's knight to land in on c7, getting rid of our bishop on c8, basically as long as we keep this bishop on c8, we're doing very well there. Therefore, white's gone and switched plan a bit and gone for a quicker break on the queen's side, even offering a pawn. So race through, we get to this position, and rook c1 rather than knight d3. Generally these days, while possible simply transpose the lines we just covered with knight d3, white actually wants to play c5 in one go, sacrificing a pawn to get play down the c-file, getting some pressure on our pawn on c7 before we're able to set up our rook f7 and defense along the 7th rank. Now, the most common move here is knight g6, but I would like to play rook f7. I think this is a bit more flexible. As we saw already in the previous video, it's vital to stop this knight landing in on c7, and so the rook on f7 does a good job. We'll see exactly why I prefer rook f7 over knight g6 later, but there's some subtlety where the knight might still be better placed on e7, controlling some important central squares. Now c5 sacrificing the pawn is the main move. White can try knight b5 first, and it's unclear whether this gains or loses time. White's attacking the pawn on a7. Now, hopefully I made it clear from the last video, we don't care about this pawn. If we've got enough time to sacrifice that pawn and just attack on the king side, then good. The problem is that by taking the pawn, white is also attacking our bishop on c8, and we really can't allow the bishop to be exchanged. Sacrificing the exchange is interesting, with a6, knight a7, rook takes, bishop takes a7 and b6, trapping this bishop in on a7, but we're not quite in time here. White's going to be quick with b4, c5 before we get involved on the king side. Therefore, the move remaining to give our bishop is b6, b4. Now white's ready to play c5 when the knight is very well placed, so time to kick the knight back, and he returns to c3. So white spent 2 tempi to provoke b6 and a6, these weaknesses in front of our king, and hopes that these will prove a weakness, make it easier for white's attack to break through. But 2 tempi are quite vital in these Mar del Plata variations. Now, I think a5 is the most accurate. We spend a tempo back. Well, it's not really a tempo because white is probably going to defend the pawn on b4. We normally don't touch these pawns on the queen side in these variations, but because we've already had to weaken the pawn with a6, we might as well push it again. The point is basically that when white plays c5, we'll want to exchange pawns on b4. If we don't play a5, then after c5, sometimes after the exchange, we'll be left with a bad passive pawn on a6, and white can gang up on it with queen a4. So it's better to simply get rid of the a pawns. We're not going to rush, by the way, taking on b4. We don't want to open lines up for white. We'll only take on b4 once white is already broken with c5. Now, it's possible to play c5 immediately, but we can take on b4. Now, white has succeeded in making some open lines for his pieces, but we've got a very strong knight on c5 here, doing a great job of blockading the c-file, meaning that it's very difficult for white to get any further. We're not really interested in our extra pawn on b4, but it's more all about this blockade. Now we can return to attacking on the king side, for example, after knight d3, g4. And here we go again. Hopefully the plans here were relatively straightforward. We're going to move the knight from e7 and play for g3. Probably knight g6 and g3 are our next 2 moves. Then we'll recapture h takes g3, fg, play queen out to g5, knight into f4, bishop to h6, rook to g7, mate on g2, and chalk up another point in identical manner. So white probably defends the pawn with a3. Now knight g6 is most flexible. We need to make space for this rook on f7 to defend the pawn on c7. This is the key point. It's our weakness in these positions we want to defend. But we also want to keep our knight on d7 for the time being, because it's doing a good job of controlling the c5 square. So let's first move the knight from e7 to g6. Now white could push immediately with c5 if we wanted, but ab. Again, the rule of thumb, take on b4 when white plays c5. In this line with knight, jump into b5. Then we'll take, and again, next we'll play bishop f8 to defend this pawn on c5. Maybe bishop d6 too, to control the pawn on c7. Followed by rook g7 and attack down the g file. Don't worry, we haven't forgotten about attacking. So knight d3. Now white is supporting c5. We don't need to worry about it particularly. But we might as well start with bishop f8. Again, rook g7 and g4 is our plan. And if c5, we can play the ab again, followed by exchanging off everything on c5. We'll keep the bishop because the bishop's going to be good on d6, blockading and defending the pawn on c7. Done plus to knight b5, bishop d6. Taking on d6 cd is just very good for us. So white needs to take this pawn. And now we can exploit a couple of tactics with bishop d7. The white isn't able to take twice on d6 because we'll have bishop a4 ideas, as we'll see in a moment. White's best is just to wait, but then we can play bishop takes b5 when we're rock solid on the queen side. White's not going anywhere. It's a shame to give up the light square bishop, but we'll still be able to make some progress on the king side with h5, rook g7 and g4. And white's attack on the king side has been neutralized. Taking on d6 fails because here we have bishop a4 with a double attack on the queen and this bishop on d6. Now, the most common move in this position is actually knight d3, when we'll simply transpose back to the previous variation with knight g6 and knight f6. We played via a different move order, but it's the same position. But I could also start with b4. After knight g6, c5, knight f6 will transpose to a line we'll cover subsequently, where white started with b4 rather than rook c1. Don't worry about these transitions so much. Our plan at least stays straightforward enough. We're going to attack on the king side, but we need a rook on f7 to make sure nothing bad happens with a knight landing in on c7. But the particular point of this move order, starting with rook c1, and the reason that Wesley So has played it quite often as white, is to play c5 here, sacrificing the pawn. We take it, and now there's a choice. White could try and exploit the fact that we played rook f7 rather than knight g6, and play bishop takes c5, dc, and then trying to collect the exchange. You shouldn't do it immediately. d6 does win the exchange, but after cd, bishop c4, knight c6, we've got two pawns to the exchange already. We have a fantastic square for a knight on d4, and we've got full control of the board. White needs to wait a moment and play bishop c4. We can't stop d6 because queen d6 allows knight b5. So we play a6, queen d6, knight b5, and then d6 happening. So we'll play a6, controlling the b5 square. We threaten b5, forcing the bishop away, and queen d6, blockading and preventing the win of the exchange. So white needs to play it now, and we take. Now taking on f7 would be similar to the line we looked at with the immediate d6 and then bishop c4. We've got two pawns for the exchange, and they're two very good central pawns. We've got good outposts for a knight on d4. Our piece is just very good. Therefore, this is actually quite difficult to play as white. He needs to be patient, build up on our rook. We just defend. Now we're threatening b5 to force matters. So white attacks our pawn on d6. And now our knight is ready to jump in to the big square on d4. White actually only has one move to retain equality here, and it's hardly the most logical. He needs to play this bizarre knight a4 move. Grabbing material with the exchange. Now white is material up. He's got an extra exchange for a pawn. But generally I find that the bishop pair are worth a rook and knight in this kind of position. And so we're actually a pawn up. Certainly this is no exception. Our bishops are going to be fantastic. This bishop is coming to c5. We could swear for our knight on d4. We're ready to play b5, b4. Our position plays itself, whereas it's not clear what white is doing other than sitting and trying to survive. Therefore, knight a4 should be played, trying to jump in with knight b6. We go, thank you, big square, and white needs to continue playing very well. He gives up his exchange and then jumps in with the idea that he can take on c8 and take on b7, exploiting the pin on our rook. Now he's threatening to take on f7, so we need to move the rook. And we're probably going to play bishop e5, king g7 to get out of the pin. When white will have to take on f7, he'll take the pawn on a6, and material will be level. This has been reached in a couple of correspondence games, and black is held very easily in both. I think the position is just equal. So that is bishop takes c5, trying to exploit our move order. But I don't think we need to be concerned. b4 is the thematic break. Now this is the whole point, really, of the pawn sacrifice. We'd like to go back to d7, but we don't have enough time because knight b5 is going to hit the pawn on c7, and we can't get our knights out of the way from our rook on f7 to defend the pawn on c7. So we have to go passive to a6. Now white can build up in a couple of different ways, but it's unlikely to make a difference. You start with knight d3, where we might as well play bishop d7 to control the b5 square. White wants to play knight b5, so here he'll have to prepare it with a4, and then we can get on with it with h5. Now white's threatening to take up pawn on a7, so we'll just defend it with b6, and we've transposed to the main line. So white starts with knight b5. Now I think we should attack the knight immediately. We threatened to take on b5, and then we take this pawn on b4. Clearly we couldn't take immediately on b4 because our pawn is hanging on c7. We need to get rid of the knight first. Now, a big difference with the rook on f7 over the main line with the knight on g6 is that knight takes a7 is no longer good. If our knight were on g6, then this position would be a bit treacherous for us. But here it's very useful that we're blockading the a2 to j8 diagonal, so there's no issues there. And our knight is also better on e7, controlling the central squares. After queen b3, we have b6. A nice idea. Instead of defending our knight on b4, we attack the one on a7. This knight is really our problem piece in the whole line. It's why white is justified in sacrificing his pawn with c5. And here we're exchanging it off, so we're just a pawn up. But if you think about this position with the rook back on f8 and now on g6, this wouldn't really work because knight c6 would be annoying. And this is why rook f7 is better than knight g6. In fact, white has one way of keeping equality here, but it's very tough. He has to play knight back to b5. Now, if we had time to play knight c5, we'd be doing very well. So white needs to sacrifice a piece. Currently, he's a piece for a pawn down, but this pin is annoying. And so the simplest is to give back the piece when material is level. Now, if white doesn't attack our knight again with queen c4, then we'll play queen b8, getting out of the pin, and our pieces will be nice and active. So he needs to attack our knight again with queen c4. And here, bishop b5, and the tactics work for us. If he takes on c7, we can take on c4 and e2. If the queen goes back, we can exchange bishops and get out of the pin. And if queen takes b5, here it looks like we're in trouble. We're a piece down, and our knight is hanging. But knight d4, both bishops are attacked. He'll have to move the one from e2, because otherwise the rook would hang as well. Then we'll take on d8. Material will be level. We've got a nice knight on d4. We can put pressure on pawn a2. I think white should hold, but we're definitely the ones pressing. White could try queen b3, defending this pawn on b4. I think we should just get on with it. With the king side, h5. Okay, material's now level, knight g6. And our plan is the traditional old g4, g3, exchange, h4, bishop h6, queen g5, knight f4. You know the story. We crash through. We might be playing without a knight on a6, but I don't think it's so relevant. The attack is still dangerous. Therefore, a4 is a normal way to do it. We continue with our plan, h5. At least here the queen is controlling the g4 square, so we're a bit slower. We can't just immediately crash through. So knight d3. White is defending the pawn on b4 now, so he's ready to take on a7. So let's just defend it with b6. Now white plays bishop e1 generally, a slightly odd-looking move. The point is to defend the pawn on b4 to move the knight from d3. But we won't worry too much. Bishop f6. This is quite a typical position for the line with c5. We're a pawn up, but our problems are this knight on a6 is quite passive. We're stuck defending the pawn on c7. But it's not clear either how white is improving his position. Our plan is not really going to surprise you. Rook g7 and g4, we're going for it. But another plan is to shuffle things around a bit, move our queen from d8 and the knight from e7 and get the bishop to d8. Then our queen is free. If we can move the knight from a6, we're going to be happy. White can move his knight from let's say knight from d3 to f2, and then he can win back the pawn with knight takes d6 and bishop takes a6. But we're very happy to see that. Material will be back to level, but we've lost our problem piece, this knight on a6. And it's unclear how white is getting any further on the king side. So I think we can be happy enough here. But this is quite a topical line, so you should pay attention to this pawn sacrifice. We need to play a few accurate moves to make sure that white doesn't crash through. Thanks for watching. See you again soon. Bye.